My name is Claire Bennett, and the day my mother tried to give away my property in front of 150 guests was the day I finally stopped trying to earn her love. People think family betrayal happens suddenly, like a lightning strike. One moment, everything is normal. The next moment, everything is destroyed. But that's not how it happens. Real betrayal grows slowly, year after year, excuse after excuse, until one day, you look back and realize you've been standing alone for a very long time. I was 34 years old when I finally understood that. And it started with a lake house. Not a mansion. Not some luxury estate worth millions. Just a beautiful old lake house sitting on the edge of Silver Pine Lake in northern Washington. The kind of place where mornings smelled like pine trees and coffee. The kind of place where the water looked like glass before sunrise. The kind of place that carried memories in every corner. To most people, it was property. To me, it was my grandfather. Every board, every window, every scratch on the wooden dock, every fishing rod hanging in the garage, every photograph on the walls. It was him. And after he died, it was all I had left. Unfortunately, it was also the one thing my mother wanted. Not for herself, for my younger sister. Because in our family, everything eventually belonged to Lauren. If you asked people in Seattle what they thought of Diane Bennett, they'd probably describe her as charming, elegant, successful, generous, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, hosted charity galas, sent expensive Christmas gifts, the kind of woman who knew everybody, and somehow always ended up at the center of every photograph. My mother was beautiful, even in her 60s. Perfect blonde hair, perfect smile, perfect posture. Everything about her looked carefully designed, including her reputation. Especially her reputation. Most people never saw the version of her that existed behind closed doors. The version I grew up with. The version that treated affection like a reward. The version that decided which daughter mattered more. Lauren and I were 3 years apart. Growing up, she was sunshine. I was responsibility. Lauren was celebrated. I was expected. When Lauren got a B in school, my mother took her out for ice cream. When I got straight A's, my mother asked why one of them wasn't an A+. When Lauren forgot chores, it was because she was busy. When I forgot chores, it was because I was selfish. You learn a lot about your place in a family by age 10. By age 12, I already knew. Lauren was the daughter my mother wanted. I was the daughter she settled for. The funny thing is, I never hated my sister. Not then. Not even later. Lauren wasn't cruel. Not intentionally. She simply grew up in a world where doors opened automatically. Where people solved problems for her. Where consequences rarely lasted long. It's difficult to blame someone for believing they're special when everyone spends decades telling them they are. Still, there were moments. Moments that stayed with me. Like the Christmas when I was 14. I had spent 3 months saving money from babysitting. Every dollar. Every tip. Every spare coin. I bought my mother a silver bracelet she'd admired in a store window. I wrapped it myself, placed it under the tree, and waited. Christmas morning came. Lauren received a new laptop, designer clothes, concert tickets, a dozen expensive gifts. I received a sweater. One sweater. When Mom opened my bracelet, she smiled politely, then set it aside. 20 minutes later, she was helping Lauren set up her laptop. The bracelet remained forgotten on the coffee table. That night, I found it still sitting there, unopened, untouched. I remember carrying it upstairs, sitting on my bed, and telling myself it didn't matter. That sounds ridiculous now, but children are experts at explaining away disappointment. It's how they survive. My father used to notice. Not always, but sometimes. His name was Richard Bennett. A quiet man. An accountant. The kind of person who spoke only when necessary. One evening, after the bracelet incident, he knocked on my bedroom door. "You okay?" I shrugged. He sat beside me. For several minutes, we said nothing. Then he handed me a small envelope. Inside was $50. "What is this?" "You worked hard for that gift." I looked at him. "You noticed." His expression changed. Just slightly. The kind of sadness adults think children can't see. "I notice more than you think." Then he stood, paused, and said something I wouldn't fully understand until years later. "Sometimes people love who they need you to be instead of who you are." At 14, I didn't understand. At 34, I understood perfectly. My grandfather understood too. His name was Arthur Bennett ***, and he was the best person I've ever known. Grandpa Arthur built the lake house himself. Not alone. Friends helped. Neighbors helped. But he designed it. Hammered nails into it. Painted walls. Built the dock. Planted the trees. He used to joke that the house contained more of his DNA than his actual children. Every summer growing up, I spent weeks there, while Lauren attended dance camps and beach vacations. I sat on the dock listening to Grandpa tell stories. Stories about Vietnam. Stories about building his first business. Stories about mistakes. Regrets. Second chances. Life. He treated me like my opinions mattered. Like my thoughts had value. Like I existed. That may sound small, but when you've spent your life competing for attention, being seen feels extraordinary. The last 4 years of Grandpa's life were difficult. Cancer. Treatments. Hospital visits. Good days. Bad days. The usual cycle. Lauren visited occasionally. Birthdays. Major holidays. Family photographs. My mother came when other people were watching. But I was there. Not because I expected anything. Because I loved him. I drove him to appointments. Picked up medications. Cooked meals. Sat beside him during chemotherapy. Listened when he was scared. Stayed when he couldn't sleep. And in return, he gave me something far more valuable than money. He gave me honesty. One evening, about 6 months before he died, we sat on the dock watching sunset. The lake reflected orange and gold light. The air smelled like cedar trees. He stared across the water quietly, then said, "Promise me something." "What?" "Don't spend your life chasing approval." I laughed. "That's specific." "I'm serious." I looked at him. His face seemed older than usual. More tired. "You know your mother will never be satisfied." I didn't answer, because hearing truth out loud sometimes hurts. He smiled gently. "Claire, yeah. Some people mistake control for love." The words settled between us. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Accurate. Then he pointed toward the lake. "Look at that." "What?" "The reflection." I watched sunlight dance across the water. "Beautiful." He nodded. "Exactly." Then he said something that changed my life. Beautiful things don't beg to be valued. 3 months later, he died. And everything changed. Not immediately, but eventually. Because grief reveals character. And nothing reveals character faster than inheritance. The reading of the will took place on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The entire family attended. My mother, Lauren, my father, a few relatives, Grandpa's attorney. Everyone expected a straightforward process, including me. Then the attorney opened the final document, and the room changed. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and read the words that would set the stage for everything that followed. The Silver Pine Lake property shall transfer solely to my granddaughter, Claire Bennett. Silence. Complete silence. My mother's smile disappeared. Lauren blinked. What? The attorney continued reading. But nobody listened, because everyone was staring at me. And for the first time, I realized my grandfather had left me something far more complicated than a house. He had left me a battle. And sitting across the room, watching my mother's expression harden, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody openly challenged the will. That would have been too obvious. Too messy. Too public. My mother preferred battles that happened behind smiles. The kind where everyone could pretend nothing was wrong. As we left the attorney's office, Lauren caught up to me in the parking lot. Rain tapped softly against the pavement. Claire. I turned. She looked confused more than angry. Did Grandpa ever tell you about this? I shook my head. No. She folded her arms. Not once. Not once. For a moment she looked hurt. Genuinely hurt. And I felt bad for her. Because unlike my mother, Lauren wasn't a strategist. She wasn't calculating. She was simply accustomed to being chosen. And this time, she hadn't been. I thought he'd leave it to both of us. So did I. She stared at the ground, then nodded. Okay. And walked away. That was it. No fight. No drama. No accusations. At least not yet. 3 days later, my mother called. I knew exactly why before answering. Hi, Mom. Claire. That tone. The polite one. The dangerous one. I've been thinking. Of course she had. You know the lake house means a lot to Lauren. I smiled. There it was. Straight to business. It means a lot to me too. Well, obviously. A pause. But Lauren always imagined raising a family there. I nearly laughed. Lauren hadn't spent more than 10 nights there in the previous decade. Meanwhile, I'd practically lived there during Grandpa's illness. Still, I kept my voice calm. Grandpa knew that. What's that supposed to mean? It means he made his decision. Silence. Then, you don't think he expected you to share? There it was. The beginning. Not asking. Pressuring. Not respecting the will. Questioning it. I leaned back in my chair. Did he tell you that? No. Then we're both guessing. Her voice cooled. I just think family should be generous. Interesting. Because generosity in our family always seemed to flow in one direction. Toward Lauren. Never away from her. Over the next 6 months, the conversations continued. Not direct demands. Suggestions. Hints. Comments. Little nudges. The psychological equivalent of dripping water on stone. Eventually, the goal becomes erosion. At Thanksgiving, Lauren and Michael were looking at schools near the lake. At Christmas, the property taxes must be exhausting. At Easter, maintaining that place alone isn't practical. Every holiday carried another message hidden beneath polite conversation. Give it up. Give it up. Give it up. I never did. Meanwhile, life moved forward. I worked as a landscape architect in Seattle. Long hours. Good clients. Decent money. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable. The lake house became my refuge. Every other weekend, I drove north. Spent time repairing old decks, painting fences, replacing worn boards, keeping Grandpa's dream alive. The place healed me, especially after difficult weeks, especially after family gatherings. Sometimes, I'd sit on the dock at sunrise with coffee in my hands, listening to the water, listening to silence, and thinking about Grandpa. On those mornings, I almost forgot there was a conflict at all. Then Lauren got engaged, and everything accelerated. His name was Michael Harper. Successful, good-looking, friendly, the kind of man who remembered names. I liked him, which made things harder, because he wasn't the villain. Not even close. If anything, he often seemed confused by the tension. Their engagement party took place at a waterfront restaurant downtown. About 80 guests attended. Family, friends, coworkers, business associates. Champagne flowed. Music played. Everyone smiled. The perfect evening, at least on the surface. Halfway through dinner, my mother stood to make a toast. Immediately, my stomach tightened. Experience had taught me to fear her speeches. They rarely ended well for me. She lifted her glass. To Lauren and Michael. Applause followed. She smiled warmly. Watching you build your future together has been one of the greatest joys of my life. Lauren beamed. Michael squeezed her hand. The room melted. Then, my mother continued. And speaking of the future, there it was. The shift. Subtle. Dangerous. I felt it immediately. She looked directly at me. The family is excited about your plans for Silver Pine Lake. The room turned. 80 faces. Looking at me. My pulse slowed. Not increased. Slowed. Because suddenly, I understood exactly what was happening. Lauren frowned. What plans? Mom smiled. The lake house, sweetheart. Lauren looked confused. What about it? The smile flickered. Just for a second. My mother clearly expected Lauren to play along. Instead, she seemed genuinely lost. Interesting. Very interesting. Mom recovered quickly. Well, she laughed softly. Claire hasn't told you. Told me what? Now everyone was watching, including me. My mother took a sip of wine, buying time, then finally said, about transferring the property once you're married. The room froze. Lauren's eyes widened. Michael looked stunned. And suddenly, I realized something important. Lauren hadn't known. This wasn't a family discussion. This was my mother's fantasy. A fantasy she'd apparently been sharing with other people. For quite some time, I set down my fork, very carefully. Excuse me. Mom blinked innocently. The lake house. What about it? Her smile hardened. You're giving it to Lauren. I stared at her. Actually stared, trying to determine whether she'd truly lost touch with reality. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. I'm doing what? The restaurant fell silent. Mom lowered her glass. Claire. No. She forced a smile. We discussed this. We absolutely did not. Now whispers began moving through nearby tables. Guests exchanged glances. Lauren looked horrified. Mom. But my mother wasn't listening anymore. Because control was slipping. And she hated that. You know Grandpa would have wanted. Don't. The word left my mouth quietly. Yet somehow it silenced the room. I stood. Don't tell me what Grandpa wanted. For the first time all evening. My mother's confidence cracked. Just slightly. Enough for me to notice. And once I noticed, I couldn't stop noticing. The panic behind her eyes. The desperation. The certainty that something wasn't going according to plan. I didn't know why yet. But I would. Soon. Very soon. Because 2 days later, I received a phone call that changed everything. A phone call from a man I'd never met. A man who claimed my lake house had been promised as collateral for a debt worth nearly $500,000. And according to him, my mother had already signed the paperwork. For several seconds, I thought the caller had the wrong number. I'm sorry, I said. What? The man cleared his throat. My name is Thomas Reed. I represent Evergreen Capital. I sat upright in my office chair. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows. Outside, Seattle traffic moved normally. Inside, my world had suddenly stopped. I think you've made a mistake. I hope so. That wasn't the answer I expected. He sounded uncomfortable. Nervous even. Mr. Reed. Please call me Tom. Tom, I own the property outright. That's what concerns us. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. What exactly are you saying? There was a pause. Then, we received documents indicating Silver Pine Lake was being used as collateral against a private investment agreement. I blinked. No. I suspected you'd say that. The way he said it made my pulse quicken. Not because he doubted me. Because he didn't. 20 minutes later, Tom emailed me copies. I opened the files and immediately understood why he'd called. The signatures looked wrong. Not terrible. Not obviously fake. But wrong. Like a song played slightly off-key. Close enough to fool strangers. Not close enough to fool me. Because I knew my own handwriting. And those signatures weren't mine. Not even remotely. I stared at the screen. Then at the second document. Then the third. Each one carried my forged signature. Each one transferred authority over the lake property. Each one claimed I had willingly agreed. And every document contained the same witness. Diane Bennett. My mother. For several minutes, I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't even become angry. The human brain does strange things when confronted with something impossible. It searches for alternative explanations. Maybe there was confusion. Maybe there was a clerical error. Maybe. No. The signatures were fake. The paperwork was fake. And my mother's name appeared everywhere. There was no innocent explanation. Only an ugly one. That evening, I drove to Silver Pine Lake. The trip usually relaxed me. Not this time. The highway blurred past. Trees. Mountains. Water. None of it registered. All I could see were those documents. My mother's signature. My forged name. The implication behind them. Someone had tried to use my property. Not ask for it. Not pressure me into giving it away. Use it. Without permission. Without telling me. Without caring what happened afterward. I arrived just before sunset. The lake looked beautiful. Calm. Peaceful. The kind of beauty that makes problems seem smaller. Except this problem wasn't small. I unlocked the front door. Stepped inside. And immediately felt Grandpa's presence. Not literally. Just memories. The old clock in the hallway. The photographs. The worn armchair near the fireplace. Everything exactly as he'd left it. I walked into the kitchen, made coffee, then sat at the dining table with the documents spread before me. And for the first time, I cried. Not because of the property, not because of the money, because of what it meant. Because no matter how many excuses I'd made over the years, some part of me still believed my mother loved me. Maybe imperfectly, maybe conditionally, but still loved me. These documents shattered that illusion. People don't forge legal paperwork against someone they love. The next morning, I called the attorney who handled Grandpa's estate. Her name was Sandra Collins. She'd known my grandfather for almost 20 years. After reviewing the documents, she became very quiet. Then she said 4 words. Do not contact them. Them. Your mother, anyone involved. I frowned. Why? Because if these documents are what they appear to be. She stopped, choosing her words carefully. This is far more serious than a family dispute. I looked at the lake through the window. What should I do? Let me investigate. The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 very long weeks. 3 weeks during which my mother called repeatedly, texted repeatedly, invited me to dinners, family events, lunches, coffee meetings, more contact than she'd initiated in the previous 3 years combined. Interesting. Very interesting. Almost like she was worried. One Saturday morning, Sandra finally called. Claire. Her voice sounded different. Sharper. What happened? We found the lender. And they never met you. Not surprising. But they met your mother. I closed my eyes. Of course they did. Sandra continued. According to their records, Diane represented herself as acting with your authorization. The room seemed smaller suddenly. What does that mean? It means she claimed she had legal authority. I gripped the phone tighter. And did she? No. The answer arrived instantly. Without hesitation. No. I stared at the dock outside. The place Grandpa built. The place he trusted me to protect. What else? Sandra exhaled slowly. Claire. What? There were multiple meetings. My stomach dropped. Multiple. Over 8 months. 8 months. Not one bad decision. Not one impulsive mistake. 8 months of planning. 8 months of deception. 8 months of lies. The truth became clearer over the following days. And somehow, it became worse. My mother wasn't trying to give the property to Lauren. Not really. That had only been the public story. The respectable story. The version designed to sound loving. The actual situation was very different. 2 years earlier, she'd invested heavily in a luxury event company. One of her friends had convinced her it would double in value. It didn't. The company collapsed. The investment vanished. And my mother lost nearly everything she'd put into it. Money she never told anyone about. Not even my father. Especially not my father. Because Diane Bennett hated appearing unsuccessful. More than almost anything. The debt grew. Interest accumulated. Pressure mounted. Eventually, someone needed collateral. Something valuable. Something substantial. Something she could access. And that's when she looked towards Silver Pine Lake. Not because it belonged to Lauren. Not because it belonged to the family. Because it belonged to me. And in her mind, those were apparently the same thing. The most painful part wasn't the fraud. It wasn't the forged signatures. It wasn't even the debt. It was learning how long she'd been telling people the lake house would eventually belong to Lauren. Years. Literal years. Friends believed it. Relatives believed it. Business associates believed it. Even Lauren believed it. My mother had created an alternate reality. One where my ownership was temporary. One where my grandfather's wishes were merely an inconvenience. One where everything eventually returned to her control. Then Sandra discovered something unexpected. Something that changed the entire situation. There's another document. I frowned. What document? It wasn't filed publicly. Okay. But we found a draft copy. I sat forward. What kind of draft? Silence. Then, a transfer agreement. The words landed like a stone. A transfer agreement to who? Sandra answered immediately. Not Lauren. I stopped breathing. If not Lauren. Michael. Lauren's fiancé. The room spun. Not Lauren. Not family. Michael. The future son-in-law. The man who probably had no idea any of this was happening. Suddenly, everything made sense. The engagement party. The public announcement. The pressure. The urgency. My mother wasn't trying to fulfill some sentimental family dream. She was trying to create legitimacy. A story. A narrative. If enough people believed the lake house was destined for Lauren and Michael, then eventually the transfer might appear normal. Expected. Reasonable. She'd been building that story for years. And now, I had proof. Real proof. Not suspicions. Not feelings. Evidence. Documents. Emails. Financial records. Witness statements. Everything. For the first time since this nightmare began. I wasn't afraid. Because truth has a unique kind of power. Especially when documented. 3 weeks later, an invitation arrived. Heavy cream-colored paper. Gold lettering. Elegant. Expensive. The engagement celebration for Lauren and Michael. 150 guests. Business leaders. Family. Friends. Local press. The biggest event my mother had ever organized. And attached to the invitation, a handwritten note from her. I hope we can finally put our differences behind us. Love, Mom. I stared at the note, then laughed softly. Because after everything I discovered, I knew exactly what she meant. She thought I still didn't know. She thought I would arrive unprepared. She thought she controlled the story. What she didn't know was that Sandra had spent the last month preparing a very different ending. And at that engagement party, in front of everyone, she wanted to impress. The truth was finally going to walk into the room. The night of the engagement celebration arrived cold and clear. Downtown Seattle sparkled beneath thousands of lights. The event was being held inside the Grand Harbor Ballroom. The kind of place people rented when they wanted everyone to know how successful they were. Crystal chandeliers. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Champagne towers. Live music. Everything expensive. Everything perfect. Everything exactly the way my mother liked it. I parked across the street and sat in my car for a moment. Not because I was nervous. Because I was remembering. Grandpa used to say something whenever life became complicated. The truth doesn't need help, it just needs time. Tonight, time was finally up. When I entered the ballroom, conversations buzzed around me. At least 150 people filled the room. Business owners. Lawyers. Local politicians. Family friends. Relatives. People my mother desperately wanted to impress. She spotted me almost immediately. and smiled. The same smile she'd worn my entire life whenever she believed she'd won. "Claire, Mom." She kissed my cheek. "Thank you for coming. I wouldn't have missed it." The answer seemed to satisfy her. That was fine. Let her feel comfortable. For a little longer. Lauren looked beautiful. Simple white dress. Elegant makeup. Genuine happiness. For the first time in months, I actually felt sorry for her. Because unlike everyone else involved, she still had no idea what was happening. When she hugged me, she whispered, "I'm glad you're here." I hugged her back and realized she meant it. No manipulation. No agenda. Just relief. For a brief moment, I wondered if I should tell her. Warn her. Protect her from what was coming. But it was too late. The machine had already been set in motion. Michael approached a few minutes later. "Claire." "Michael." He smiled. "You surviving?" I laughed. "Barely." "Same." Then he lowered his voice. "Your mom has planned this thing like a military operation." That made me laugh for real. Because it was true. And because he clearly had no idea how accurate that statement actually was. An hour later, the speeches began. First Lauren. Then Michael. Then Michael's parents. Everything proceeded normally. Exactly as expected. Until my mother stood. The room applauded. Of course they did. Diane Bennett lived for moments like this. The spotlight found her instantly. She raised her champagne glass. And the room fell silent. "I want to thank everyone for being here." Polite applause. She smiled warmly. "Tonight isn't just about Lauren and Michael." I almost rolled my eyes. Because somehow, it always became about her. This is a celebration of family. There it was. The word. Family. The weapon she wrapped in ribbon whenever she wanted something. She continued. "Family means trust." The irony nearly killed me. Family means sacrifice. Interesting choice. Family means supporting each other through every season of life. Sandra Collins sat quietly across the room. Watching. Waiting. Exactly like me. Then my mother shifted direction. The same way she had at the engagement dinner months earlier. Only this time, she intended to finish the performance. Many of you know the history of the Bennett family lake property. Several guests nodded. Exactly as she'd hoped. Because she'd spent years telling the story. Years creating expectations. Years planting seeds. And tonight, she said proudly, "I believe it's time to look toward the future." My pulse remained steady. Very steady. Because I knew what was coming. She gestured toward Lauren and Michael. "They represent the next chapter." The crowd smiled. A few people applauded. Then my mother looked directly at me and said, "Claire has always understood the importance of family." I heard Sandra quietly exhale. The moment had arrived. Which is why, my mother continued, she has agreed to help secure that future. The ballroom erupted into applause. Lauren looked confused. Michael looked confused. I stood perfectly still, watching, listening, waiting. Then an assistant appeared, carrying a leather folder. My mother accepted it, opened it, and removed several documents. The audience couldn't see them, but I could. Property transfer forms, not originals, ceremonial copies, prepared for a public signing, prepared for a public surrender, prepared for humiliation. My humiliation. My mother smiled brightly. "Claire." The room turned toward me. 150 faces. Every eye watching. every phone recording, every guest expecting a heartwarming family moment. Would you join us? The applause continued. People smiled. Some even stood, certain they were witnessing generosity, tradition, family unity. Instead, they were about to witness something else entirely. I walked toward the stage. Slowly, calmly, the crowd parted. My heels echoed against the polished floor. My mother looked relieved, victorious, certain. When I reached her, she handed me the folder. "Thank you," she whispered. I smiled. For what? Her expression faltered. Just slightly. Then recovered. For doing the right thing. The right thing. Interesting. I opened the folder. Glanced at the papers. Exactly what I'd expected. Transfer documentation. Prepared for signatures. Prepared for photographs. Prepared for headlines. I closed the folder. Then turned toward the microphone. The ballroom quieted. My mother frowned. Because this wasn't part of her script. Before I sign anything, I said, "I'd like to thank someone." The audience relaxed. Perfect. That was exactly what I wanted. Let them think everything was normal. For another 30 seconds. My grandfather, Arthur Bennett. The room softened. Several relatives smiled. He taught me many things. I paused. Most importantly, I looked directly at my mother. He taught me that trust is earned. The room grew quieter. Something had changed. People could feel it, even if they didn't understand it yet. My mother shifted beside me. Uncomfortable. I also want to thank Sandra Collins. Several heads turned. Sandra stood slowly. Professional. Composed. Confident. My mother's face went white. Not pale. White. The kind of white that appears when someone suddenly realizes the ground beneath them isn't stable. Sandra walked toward the stage. The room watched silently. Nobody understood. Yet, my mother certainly did. Because the moment Sandra appeared beside me, I saw panic. Real panic. For the first time in my life. I handed Sandra the microphone. She accepted it calmly. Then said, "My name is Sandra Collins. I represented Arthur Bennett's estate." The room became completely silent. Not quiet. Silent. Over the last several weeks, Sandra continued, I have been investigating unauthorized attempts to transfer ownership of Silver Pine Lake. A collective murmur moved through the audience. My mother stopped breathing. Or at least it looked that way. Sandra opened a file, removed several documents, and continued. These attempts involved forged signatures. Gasps. Whispers. Confusion. Shock. The atmosphere changed instantly. One moment a celebration. The next, something else. Something dangerous. My mother stepped forward. "Diana, what is this?" Sandra ignored her. "The property legally belongs to Claire Bennett." More murmurs. More confusion. Then, we also discovered multiple financial agreements executed without the owner's knowledge. The ballroom exploded into whispers. People stared. Questions spread through the room like wildfire. And standing beside me, for the very first time, my mother looked exactly what she was. Not powerful. Not admired. Not respected. Afraid. And the worst part, the real evidence hadn't even been shown yet. The whispers spread through the ballroom like a storm. 150 guests. 150 people trying to understand what was happening. A few moments earlier, they had expected an engagement celebration. Now, They were watching a family unravel. My mother stepped toward Sandra. "That's enough." Sandra didn't even look at her. Instead, she removed another document from the file. The investigation uncovered multiple forged signatures and unauthorized financial agreements involving Silver Pine Lake. The room fell silent again. The kind of silence that only appears when people realize they're witnessing something real. Something that wasn't supposed to become public. My father stood up. Slowly. Confused. What financial agreements? For the first time all evening. My mother looked genuinely frightened. "Richard." "No." His voice cut through the room. "What financial agreements?" I had never heard my father speak like that before. Not once. Not in 34 years. And judging by my mother's expression, neither had she. Sandra turned toward him. "Mr. Bennett, were you aware of the investment losses connected to Harbor Elite events?" My father's face changed. "What losses?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My mother stared at Sandra. Then at me. Then back at Sandra. As though she still couldn't believe this was happening. As though she expected the universe to correct itself. To restore her control. It didn't. Sandra continued. "The company collapsed approximately 2 years ago." My father's expression hardened. "What company?" Again. No answer from my mother. Only silence. The dangerous kind. The kind that tells everyone exactly what they need to know. A businessman near the front table suddenly frowned. "I remember that company." Another guest nodded. "So do I." Someone else whispered. "They lost a fortune." The room shifted. Information connecting. Pieces fitting together. The story beginning to make sense. My father looked at my mother. "Diane." Nothing. "Diane." Still nothing. Finally, she whispered, "I was going to fix it." The room froze. Because everyone recognized the sentence. The universal language of bad decisions. I was going to fix it. I was going to tell you. I was going to make things right. The promises people make after getting caught. My father sat down slowly. Not angry. Not yelling. Just deflated. As though decades of trust had suddenly become very heavy. Then Sandra revealed the final document. The transfer agreement. The one connected to Michael. The one my mother never expected anyone to find. She handed copies to several individuals near the front. Including Michael. Including my father. Including Lauren. I watched Lauren read it. Then read it again. Then stare at her mother. "What is this?" No answer. Lauren's voice shook. "Mom." Nothing. She looked at Michael. Then back at the paper. Then at me. And suddenly, understanding arrived. The transfer wasn't intended for her. Not really. She'd been used too. Used as part of the story. Used as justification. Used as a reason. A symbol. A convenient explanation. Nothing more. Michael slowly lowered the document. "You were going to put this property in my name." My mother opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Nothing came out. Because there was no explanation that sounded reasonable anymore. Not in front of witnesses. Not in front of evidence. Not in front of reality. Lauren stood. Tears filling her eyes. "You told me Grandpa wanted this." Silence. "You told me Claire was holding it temporarily." Silence. "You told me it was supposed to be ours." More silence. The room watched. Nobody interrupted. Because truth had finally arrived. And truth rarely needs assistance. Then Lauren asked the question that mattered most. The question nobody else had asked. Did Grandpa actually leave it to Claire because he trusted her? The answer was obvious. Everyone knew it. My mother knew it. Lauren knew it. I knew it. And that made it hurt even more. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Lauren sat down. Slowly, quietly, and looked away from her mother. That moment seemed to hurt Diane Bennett more than anything else that night. Not the guests. Not the evidence. Not the embarrassment. Her golden child had stopped believing her. The ballroom felt smaller now. More honest. The carefully crafted image my mother had spent years building was collapsing in real time. Not because I destroyed it. Because it couldn't survive the truth. Eventually, Sandra handed the microphone back to me. The room turned. Waiting. Expecting revenge. Expecting anger. Expecting humiliation. Instead, I looked at Lauren. Then my father. Then the guests. And finally, my mother. You know what's strange? Nobody answered. When Grandpa left me the lake house, I smiled sadly. I thought the house was the inheritance. The room listened. But it wasn't. I glanced toward the windows overlooking Seattle. The city lights reflected against the glass. The inheritance was understanding. I paused. He taught me that people eventually reveal who they are. Nobody moved. He taught me that love isn't ownership. I looked toward my mother. And he taught me that protecting something valuable sometimes means refusing to surrender it. For the first time all evening, nobody looked at my mother. They looked at me. Not because I had won. Because they understood. I reached into my purse. Removed a folded piece of paper. The last note Grandpa ever wrote me. I carried it everywhere. The paper was old now. Worn along the edges. But the words remained clear. I unfolded it. And read the final line aloud. Beautiful things don't beg to be valued. The room remained silent. Then I folded the note. Placed it back in my purse. And smiled. Not a victorious smile. Not a revenge smile. A peaceful one. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't fighting. I wasn't defending. I wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. The truth had already done the work. The engagement party ended early. People left quietly. Conversations hushed. Questions unanswered. Speculation everywhere. But none of it mattered. Not anymore. As guests departed, Lauren approached me. Her eyes were red. I didn't know. I believed her. I know. She looked down. Then whispered, "I'm sorry." 3 words. Simple. Honest. Real. More valuable than every speech delivered that night. I hugged her. And for the first time in years, it felt like I was hugging a sister. Not a competitor. Not a favorite child. A sister. Michael shook my hand before leaving. I had no idea. I know. He nodded. Then glanced toward my mother. I think a lot of people are realizing that tonight. My father was the last family member to approach me. He looked older somehow. Tired. Like a man reviewing decades of memories through a different lens. "I'm sorry, Claire." I swallowed hard. For what? His eyes filled. For not seeing enough. That one hurt. Because it was true. And because I knew he meant it. Then everyone left. Except me. And my mother. Standing alone in the nearly empty ballroom. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The chandeliers glowed overhead. Staff cleared tables. Music had stopped. Everything felt strangely quiet. Finally, She looked at me. I never thought you'd do this. I almost laughed. Because even now, she didn't understand. This embarrassed me. I stared at her, then shook my head. No. She frowned. You did. No, Mom. I picked up my coat. You embarrassed yourself. The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Because they were true. She looked away. And for the first time in my life, I saw someone who wasn't powerful, wasn't intimidating, wasn't larger than life. Just a woman. A woman whose need for control had cost her almost everything. I walked toward the exit, then stopped, one final thought occurring to me. I turned back. You know the saddest part? She didn't answer. You could have just asked. Her eyes widened slightly. The answer would have been no. I smiled sadly. But at least we would have still been a family. And with that, I walked away, leaving behind the ballroom, the lies, the expectations, and the battle I'd spent most of my life fighting. Outside, the cold Seattle air greeted me. Across the water, city lights shimmered like stars. For the first time since Grandpa died, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, not happiness. Freedom. Real freedom. The kind that arrives when you finally stop carrying other people's version of who you're supposed to be. And as I drove towards Silver Pine like that night, I realized something beautiful. My grandfather hadn't left me a house. He'd left me a choice. To protect what mattered, or surrender it for approval. And finally, after 34 years, I had chosen myself. The first winter after the engagement party was quiet. Not peaceful. Not happy. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives after a storm destroys everything that was already weak. For months, I barely heard from my mother. No calls. No emails. No invitations. No attempts to explain herself. At first, I expected another confrontation. Another argument. Another effort to regain control. But none came. Instead, there was silence. And for the first time in my life, I realized how much energy I had spent preparing for conflict. Without it, life felt strangely light. Spring arrived slowly at Silver Pine Lake. The snow melted. The dock reappeared. The trees turned green again. And every weekend, I found myself working on the property. Not repairing it. Improving it. Expanding it. Building something new. Something Grandpa had talked about for years. Something he'd dreamed about long before cancer entered the picture. A community learning center. Not a business. Not a resort. Not luxury cabins. A place where local children could learn about nature. Fishing. Conservation. Forestry. Wildlife. The things Grandpa loved most. The things he believed every child should experience. One evening, I found an old notebook in the attic. Dust covered the cover. The pages had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words. Silver Pine Youth Project. My heart stopped. Slowly, I opened it. Inside were sketches, plans, budgets, ideas, years of ideas, camp programs, reading workshops, scholarship plans, environmental education events. Everything. The dream he'd never had time to finish. I sat on the attic floor for nearly an hour, turning pages, reading notes, looking at drawings. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. 3 months later, I launched the Silver Pine Foundation. At first it was small, Very small. A handful of volunteers. A few local teachers. Some retired neighbors. Several friends. Nothing impressive. Nothing flashy. Just people willing to help. The first summer, 23 children attended. 23. That was it. But Grandpa would have loved every second of it. They learned to fish. Learned to identify trees. Learned how ecosystems worked. Built birdhouses. Read books on the dock. Watched sunsets over the lake. Simple things. Beautiful things. The kind that matter. Word spread quickly. The following year, 70 children attended. Then 150. Then 300. Families came from all over Washington. Teachers volunteered. Businesses donated supplies. Local newspapers wrote articles. Environmental organizations partnered with us. Within 5 years, the Silver Pine Foundation became one of the largest youth outdoor education programs in the region. And every child who visited learned about Arthur Bennett, not because his name appeared everywhere, because his values did. The lake house remained exactly where it had always been. But somehow, it became something larger. Not just property, not just an inheritance, a legacy. As for Lauren, our relationship changed slowly, painfully slowly. Trust takes time, especially after years of comparison, years of favoritism, years of misunderstanding. But she tried, and that mattered. A year after the engagement party, she invited me to dinner. Just the two of us. No parents. No drama. No expectations. Halfway through the meal, she asked, "Do you know something embarrassing?" "What?" She smiled. "I spent most of my life believing Mom was always right." I laughed. "That's not embarrassing. It is now." For the first time, we were able to talk honestly. Not as rivals. Not as competitors. As sisters. The relationship wasn't perfect. Maybe it never would be. But it became real. And real is often better than perfect. Michael turned out to be exactly who I thought he was. A decent man. A man who valued honesty. He married Lauren 6 months later. In a small ceremony by the lake. No grand ballroom. No giant speeches. No performances. Just family. The family that remained. The family worth keeping. My father retired 2 years later. One afternoon, he joined me on the dock. The same dock where Grandpa and I used to sit. We watched the water quietly. For nearly 30 minutes. Then he finally spoke. "I should have protected you more." The words hung in the air. Heavy. Honest. I stared at the lake. "You did what you could." "No." His voice cracked slightly. "I did what was easy." That hurt. Because I knew it cost him something to admit it. People rarely change in dramatic moments. They change in small ones. Quiet ones. Truthful ones. And that was one of them. I reached over. Placed my hand on his shoulder. And for the first time in decades, neither of us needed to say anything else. My mother's story unfolded differently. The public embarrassment from the engagement party spread quickly. Not because I talked about it. I never did. People talk. Especially wealthy people. Especially social circles built on reputation. Within months, several organizations quietly removed her from leadership positions. Invitations stopped arriving. Committees replaced her. Boards moved on. Friends became distant. The image she'd spent years constructing slowly disappeared. Not overnight, but steadily, like sand washing away with the tide. 3 years after the engagement party, She visited Silver Pine Lake. Unexpectedly, I was planting trees with a group of students when her car arrived. For a moment, I considered leaving. Instead, I stayed. She approached slowly, looking older than I remembered. Not weaker, just older. The kind of older that comes from reflection, regret, time. She watched the children for several minutes, then asked, "What is all this?" I looked around. Children building birdhouses, teachers leading workshops, volunteers helping families, the lake sparkling behind them. This is Grandpa's dream. Her eyes moved across the property, across the people, across the life. And for the first time, she seemed to understand, really understand, what she had almost destroyed. After a long silence, she whispered, "He would have loved this." I nodded. Yes. More silence. Then, I was jealous. The confession surprised me. Perhaps because it arrived years too late. Or perhaps because it arrived at all. I looked at her. Of what? She stared toward the lake. The way he looked at you. I didn't answer. Because suddenly, everything made sense. Not the decisions. Not the fraud. Not the lies. But the wound beneath them. The insecurity. The need to control. The need to be chosen. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered something important. Understanding someone isn't the same as excusing them. She stayed for less than an hour. Before leaving, she paused beside her car. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I looked toward the lake, toward the children laughing, toward the life I'd built, then back at her, and answered honestly, "I think I already have." Tears filled her eyes. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. She nodded slowly. Because finally, she understood that too. 10 years later, Silver Pine Lake looked different. Larger, stronger, more alive. Thousands of children had passed through the foundation. Thousands. Scholarships had been awarded. Programs had expanded. Dreams had begun. Lives had changed. And every summer, I sat on the dock during the first sunrise of the season, exactly where Grandpa and I used to sit, coffee in hand, watching the water, remembering. On the 10th anniversary of his death, I brought his notebook with me, the old one from the attic, the one containing all his plans. Most pages were complete now. Programs launched, buildings constructed, scholarships funded, dreams realized. One by one, I turned to the final page, the last unfinished note. A single sentence written in fading ink. "Leave things better than you found them." I smiled, then looked across the lake, at children learning, families laughing, volunteers working, life growing. And for the first time, I crossed out the sentence, not because it wasn't true, because it was finished. People often ask me if I regret fighting for the property. The answer is always the same. No, because I wasn't fighting for land, or money, or ownership. I was protecting trust, memory, legacy, the things that matter after people are gone. My grandfather once told me that beautiful things don't beg to be valued. For years, I thought he was talking about the lake. Eventually, I realized he was talking about people, about self-respect, about knowing your worth, about refusing to shrink yourself so others can feel bigger. And if there's one lesson this story taught me, it's this. The people who truly love you won't require you to sacrifice yourself to prove it. Real love doesn't demand surrender. Real love doesn't need manipulation. Real love doesn't ask you to become smaller. It helps you become more of who you already are. The lake still reflects the sunrise every morning. The dock still creaks beneath footsteps. The pine trees still sway in the wind. And sometimes, when the water is perfectly still, I can almost hear Grandpa laughing. Not because I won. Not because anyone lost. Because the dream survived. And in the end, that was always the most important thing.